Hey guys, it's Coach Alex from FastFitnessTips here. Today I'm going to talk about coaching secrets, like the mystery ingredient of improving your endurance training. It's kind of important because you want to improve as efficiently as possible, right? You don't want to just be bumbling along week to week, month to month. I'm talking about how to optimize your training like in a structured way so that over time you're most prepared for your event and basically you're training efficiently. You know, most of us are time crunched in some way. We don't have infinite time like the pros to allocate to our training plans, but we still want to improve as much as possible. So today's video is a question: what should your training look like? How should you optimize your training? And what's the science behind training? Basically, we're talking about training science today and how we correlate what you do behind the scenes with actual performance, right? Now, if you're time crunched, which is a nice way of saying you're easily bored, then the bottom line of this video is, okay, you shouldn't be doing base miles on its own. Do you know that? I mean, you shouldn't be doing base miles and no higher intensity work. Actually, you shouldn't even be doing base miles and just threshold and no high intensity work. That's what we're going to kind of prove today. There are a few exceptions, but basically that's the take-home message. And if your coach is saying just do base miles over the winter and nothing else, well, pretty much your coach is kind of stuck in the 1970s and 80s. Even if they say let's just do sweet spot, they're pretty much stuck in 2004. If they say, let's do polarized training, to use a jargon term, then yeah, they're probably up to date. But exactly what should that look like? How should it be structured? And when should you apply it? That's what we're going to look at today. So let's start with some basic premises. And if this is too basic, I apologize. But I promise you, if you stay tuned to this video, you will learn some new stuff about training that you didn't already know. So the most basic fact is, to improve in terms of performance, then you need to add volume. You need to be increasing like in an incremental way. And you also need to increase intensity. Actually, studies have looked at correlating how much do you improve, like how much do your performance times improve as a function of time in zone, like how much time do you spend at low intensity, middle and high. And essentially, there is a stronger correlation between, in most endurance sports, how much you improve and how much time you spent in the lower zone, actually. Like, check out this graph here. This is performance in long distance endurance cross country as a function of time in zone 1. And there's a pretty tight relationship, I'm sure you'll agree. Even for shorter distances, there's a pretty tight relationship as well. However, you can't just do low intensity work all the time. But neither can you just do high intensity. After the Second World War, a little bit of history, Zatopek from Czechoslovakia turned the running world upside down when he won virtually everything on a background of high intensity training, basically high intensity intervals, which had never really been done before. He was tremendously successful, but actually within 10 years at the age of 33, he was almost totally burnt out. And that's the problem with just high intensity. You'll just get burnt out very quick. It's a recipe for disaster if you just do high intensity and nothing else. The opposite of that was the Arthur Lydiard School of Training from New Zealand, who actually said, no, do high volume, low intensity. And lots of high volume, low intensity actually does improve your performance a great deal. This is not just a fad because it's something that's never gone away. Even in modern elite athletes, you'll find they're doing a lot of high volume, low intensity work. For example, Kenyan runners do like 80-90% of their workouts at relatively low intensity. That's low intensity by our definition. Obviously for them, they're going easy. For us, they're going supremely fast, of course. But it's been studied in other sports, in rowing, in swimming, in ice skating, in cross-country skiing. And yes, recently in cycling as well. All of those sports have been shown to use a lot of time in zone 1, but also supplemented by time in the higher zones. In a 3-zone model, that's called zone 3. Actually, wait, let's define these zones so that we can properly understand them, okay? And I do admit this is an area where there is a lot of confusion about zones, because in cycling we tend to be wedded to that Coggan-Allen 5-zone model. By the way, you do know zones are just like a convention, right? They're mapping like categories on top of what is actually a continuum, and no zone system is perfect. They are all artifacts of our own human creation. Like, they're not fundamentally set in human physiology, even though everyone tries to tie them up. However, I'm getting distracted, so let's look at this picture of some measure of performance against exercise intensity. Now, historically, we'd use blood lactate. So basically, in a 3-zone model, this is like Seller's 3-zone model, you've got low intensity, middle intensity, and high intensity, and they're demarcated by the ventilatory threshold 1 at the lower end and ventilatory threshold 2 at the higher end, or if you like, lactate threshold 1, 2 millimoles per litre, and the higher one, lactate threshold 2, the conventional threshold, FTP threshold, 4 millimoles per litre at the higher end. However, we do know now that lactate isn't like the evil chemical we thought it was. Lactate is basically part of lactate shuttle. It is adaptive, and it's there to interface between aerobic and anaerobic. That's another way of thinking of these zones, by the way. Zone 1, let's say mostly or purely in the past aerobic. Zone 3, mostly or purely anaerobic. Zone 2 overlap, let's say 50-50. Of course, there's a continuum, but I'm saying this is the whole point, putting a category over a continuum so that we can deal with it better, because as scientists, we're often better at dealing in categories and categorical advice than dealing with continuums and advice on continuums, okay? Now, of course, you don't have to use lactate. You can use, a simple system like RPE, perceived exertion. So just simply, if you were in zone 1, you'd probably be RPE of 5 or lower. If you were in zone 3, you'd probably be RPE of 8 or higher, yeah? Of course, heart rate is still a good way to go, and nothing wrong with using heart rate. It cuts across all sports. So if you were to anchor it at heart rate max, your maximum heart rate across any activity, then let's say below 80% would be in zone 1, but above 88, maybe 90% would be in zone 3. So 80 to 87, 88 would be in that middle zone. But some people measure their heart rate across like a lactate or threshold test. Like you do a threshold test and you measure your heart rate at that junction, so-called lactate threshold heart rate. And in which case, if you did that, then below 90% would be zone 1, and above 98, 99, maybe 100%, by definition, would be in zone 3. So then the next question is, what do athletes actually do? And that's interesting because it depends on how successful they are, like how pro, how elite they are, versus how kind of recreational they are. So if you take the lower end recreational athletes, here's a nice chart of what recreational athletes tend to do in terms of their training. What they do is they spend a fair to high amount in zone 1, a middle amount in zone 2, and a relatively little amount in zone 3. That's in the 3-zone model, yeah? So they basically have what they would call a pyramidal distribution, which tends to fall with zone intensity. What about the pros? Well, they have a more so-called polarized model, which is stacked towards either end. So yeah, they also do a lot in the low zones, but they do a lot in the high zones. And what gets squeezed is that middle zone. So they don't tend to do a lot in zone 2. They may do some, but relatively speaking, that's pretty low. And actually, as mentioned, that's been found across nearly all sports now for athletes that are doing well. And that's called the polarized model. Now, how much are they doing? Well, that's subject to debate, but the most popular split is actually 80-20. Remember, that's 80% in zone 1 and 20% in zone 3, and almost nothing in the middle, i.e. kind of pretty extreme if you like. That 80-20 model was popularized by a book recently by Max Fitzgerald called The 80-20 Runner. Check it out for sure. Now, whilst that 80-20 model is pretty good for short running, intense sports, maybe short distance rowing, it's not necessarily as good for cyclists, because cycling is an event where even on one day you get tremendous variation in the endurance intensity curve. For example, you've got to get up hills with some effort, and you tend to coast down a little bit easier down hills. And across the course of 1 to 2 hours, you find your whole spectrum of time intensity represented. In other words, you get that power duration curve that we're all familiar with. Also, let's not forget, running is naturally harder in the sense that you're dragging your body across the ground with no assistance. Yeah. Quick aside here about how the pro athletes actually train. Pro cyclists might do 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 hours a year even. Runners typically do 500 up to 1,000 hours per year. Cross-country skiers, the same, biathletes. It's a huge volume. They often work out definitely every day, but often 2 a day, maybe 400, 500 sessions a year, often 8 to 14 workouts a week in some cases. And most of that training, 80-90% is zone 1, less in zone 2, more, 5-10%, maybe more in zone 3 in some cases. Not convinced? Okay, here's an actual power curve distribution for time at each watt for a pro rider, actually Thomas de Gent, and you can get these online for a variety of riders. And you'll see here that time at each watt follows this kind of peaked normal distribution. It's kind of semi-pyramidal, yeah, sure. There's a big time at 0 actually when he's just coasting or he's not pedaling. But there's a huge amount actually in the low zones as well, because even though 220 might be relatively high for you, is very low for him. Like zone 1 recovery is, around about 200 for a pro rider. And you'll see the higher the intensity, then the less time they spend in that. And that's quite typical of pros. So when we say polarized training in terms of cycling, take that with a slight pinch of salt, because it's very rare you do 0 at threshold or in those middle zones, okay? Okay, this is all really interesting, but it's all theoretical unless we can prove a link between which training model is associated with which outcome, i.e. we want the best outcome, i.e. good improvement, and ideally an efficient model of training where you're not spending a disproportionate amount of time with a relatively slow improvement. So we want an efficient model of training, and we want the best improvement ideally overall. Unfortunately, I can refer you to this brilliant review by Stogel and Sperlich, which was published in 2015 in Frontiers in Physiology, where they go through all the evidence for polarized training, review every study. But the ones you really want to concentrate on are the prospective studies where they've randomized athletes to certain training models, such as pyramidal versus HIIT versus high intensity, low volume versus polarized, and then say which one was more effective, which one did the athletes benefit most from. So here's a few examples. Billat and colleagues studied a sample of Kenyan elite athletes, and they were roughly 2 weeks out of their competition phase. They were analyzed by their training logs, and they had either like a tempo model, which is basically threshold, or a speed model, which was polarized low and high. And sure enough, those in the speed model were doing better. They actually had around 2% faster performance over 10K. You and colleagues did a study where they modified the training schedule of sprint skaters, and then they looked at their performance, and they find that when they made their training more polarized, the result was a significant improvement, about 3% on their performance compared to the previous season. Esteve and Lano experimentally allocated 20 regional and national level Spanish distance runners to one of 2 training programs, one with, let's say, a threshold model where they had zone 1, 2, and 3, 65, 25, and 10, and another one in a polarized model where it was 80, 10, 10, like semi-polarized. Sure enough, the polarized training led to a 2% greater improvement over 10K race times than the actual threshold normal training model. But probably the one you want to hear about is the cyclist, right? So Neal and colleagues 2013 recruited 11 amateur cyclists to 6 weeks of polarized training at 80-0-20, so like extreme sealer polarized model. And they compared it with 6 weeks of threshold training where the model was 55 zone 1, 45 zone 2 and 0 at zone 3. The cyclists did a variety of training protocols, all of them in random order, with actually a 4-week detraining program to equalize in between. And despite the fact that in this study the threshold training had 16% greater volume overall, all measures pointed towards a greater improvement in the polarized trained condition. So that included the 40k time trial performance, their peak power output, their power lactate threshold, and various other physiological markers. So here's an interesting thing. Even power at threshold was better in the polarized model. You'd think it was better in the threshold model given they were specifically trained in the threshold model, but the power at threshold was actually 9% improved in the polarized model versus 2% improved in the threshold model, which is really interesting. However, the definitive study on this comes from Stogel and Sperlich themselves, who looked at a group, I think it was 48 Austrian athletes who were actually cross-sport. They were recruited from cross-country skiing, running, cycling and triathlon. They assigned them to one of 4 programs, basically the whole representation of high volume, low intensity, threshold, HIIT and polarized. And if you want to know the splits, high volume was 83-16-1. Threshold was 46-54 and 0. HIIT was 43-0 and 57. And polarized was 68-6-26. Now the truth is all 4 groups improved in time to exhaustion, but the polarized group did best, not just on time to exhaustion, up by 17%, but VO2 max performance up by 11%, general peak performance up by 5%, performance up threshold up 8%, and that was compared to plus 5% at HIIT. All the results are shown in this impressive table here. So this is pre-activity, this is post-activity, and this is degree of improvement across each one. So you've got VO2 max, you've got heart rate, you've got lactic acid peak, you've got work economy, you've got an incremental power test as well. And basically, to cut a long story short, the polarized training was superior in nearly every model. So here's the distribution of their work in terms of the zones, a high volume, low intensity, threshold, HIIT and polarized. And here's the actual results shown in a graphical format. So there's VO2 max change. You can see the only group where VO2 max deteriorated was actually threshold training. So in green is sub-max performance. You can think of that as threshold performance if you like. And again, weirdly, threshold performance was actually down in threshold training. Threshold performance was up in all other groups. Time to exhaustion, you'll see, was improved in every group, but massively improved by around 17% in polarized. And performance at low threshold, equivalent to VT1 or LT1, that's in orange, and in red at LT2, you can see it was massively up in polarized compared to, example, high volume, low intensity. So that's pretty convincing, guys, from that like gold standard study. And remember, check out the review. I'll put the link below if you want to check out all of the evidence in this entirely. Now, for sure, that's not the end of the story, because we don't know how applicable those results are to other people, like regular guys, like age group athletes or just beginners, for example. But there is an interesting study where they took regular people and randomized them to either HIIT training or polarized or threshold training or a combination. And this is this study here. And they actually found pretty much exactly the same results in very normal people. Polarized training was definitely producing the best outcomes, which is encouraging. There's also follow-up studies where they looked at the results in swimming or the results in rowing or the results in ultra long distance runners. A lot of these have come out 2018 and 2019, and they're pretty much consistent, I have to say. Okay, so I've shown you all the science here, and that's great. If you think we've done something good here, take a moment to give me a like or share. Share this video with one of your friends or colleagues who you think might benefit from understanding training science a little bit more. But what I haven't done is show you how we apply this to athletes at Fast Fitness Tips, i.e. coaching. When we're coaching, what do we do? Basically, even if you're self-coached, how do you apply these models to your actual training planning? Well, look, a really, really simple way is just to do it in terms of days of the week. So in terms of your sessions, let's say you're doing 5 sessions across the week, 1 per day for 5 days with 2 days off, let's say, then obviously you could split your training with 4 days mostly in low intensity, zone 1 and zone 2, and then 1 at high intensity like VO2 max or HIIT session at zone 4 or 5, ideally 5. Yeah, so you've got that 4 and 1 split, which would correspond to that 80-20 model. Okay, it's crude, it's simple, but it probably works. Similarly, if you've got 10 sessions, you could get a little bit more sophisticated. You've got 10 sessions, so you could do 7, for example, in zone 1, zone 2, like longer, high volume, long distance, low intensity rides, weekend rides, avoid the temptation to go too hard, let's say. But then you could do 1, let's say, threshold or sweet spot type of workout, and then you could do 2 interval VO2 max workouts as well. So you'd get like a 7-1-2 split. It's really simple. You don't need a coach to tell you you can split across your sessions in that way. And that's reasonably good. No one's really criticizing a sessional approach, but there is a more accurate, a more sophisticated way to do it, and that is time in zone. But you will need some kind of calculator, formula, or spreadsheet for it because it does get complicated real quick. Now, the way this works, it's like those pro distribution of watts per time. So you can either base it on heart rate, you can base it on watts, or you can base it on RPE if you want. But essentially, you're going to split your time across each zone according to each training model. Now, here on the screen, I'll show you various training models that we've tried. So at the most crude end, not recommended by the way, but just as a point of comparison, you could have an even distribution plan where you spend the equal amount of time in zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I'm actually using the 6-zone Coggan model here. Sorry to confuse things even more, but it's useful in cycling to have the 6-zone model, which goes a little bit like this. Zone 1, active recovery, zone 2, endurance, zone 3, tempo, zone 4, threshold, zone 5, VO2 max, and then zone 6, above 120% of FTP. So if you're doing it in FTP, less than 55% active recovery, 55 to 75 endurance, 76 to 90 tempo, 91 to 105 threshold, 106 to 120 VO2 max, and then 120 or above neuromuscular, okay? So those are your 6 zones in this model. Yeah, we're going a little bit more sophisticated here. So next we have like a typical threshold plan where it just fell from zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's actually very common in recreational athletes, and it's not that bad, I have to say. Now we tweaked that to improve it in a new pyramidal plan where we do a little bit more zone 1, but decrease those ones in the middle. But we can go towards the polarized 80-20 plan where the zone 3 and 4 are really quite low in the middle. Zone 1 and 2 are emphasized, particularly zone 1. Now, if you wanted to go to the kind of Frank Overton Fast Cat coaching kind of sweet spot model, yeah, we can do that where you boost those middle zones, that's zone 3 and 4 in this diagram. You can do a purely high intensity, low volume plan, which is zone 1 and 2 emphasized. You can do a pro riders plan, which is actually extracted from the Thomas de Gendt distribution mathematically and converted into a zone formula. You can do a really clever thing with the formula that we're using here, with the calculator, which is called balanced TSS. What that does is put your stress in each zone exactly the same. Obviously, if you're going way above threshold, your TSS accumulates your TSS accumulates really fast. So basically, you can mathematically balance it out so that it equalizes across. And this is the polarized model from the 2015 Stogel and Sperlich study. There's one other one, which is our adapted one, which we would plan for most athletes, most beginners, because actually most beginners don't accommodate the 80-20 plan very well. They find that there's too much high intensity and too much low intensity in that. They find that they're tootling around too easy most of the time, and then you're asking them to go too hard in that 20%. Now, these are not just theoretical graphs, they're encoded into a calculator here where you put in either working with power, you put in working with watts, or you put in working with lactate threshold. So for example, let's say I've got 250 watts, my maximum heart rate is 180. I'm planning to do, let's say, 3 hours a week, 1 day off a week, and then ignore sweet spot. Which plan do I want to use? Well, this one's suggesting professional pyramidal plan, and then it will tell me that's a slightly efficient plan in terms of TSS per hours in. It will tell me my weekly load is going to be around 423. It's going to say my daily kilometers on average on a typical course, if I followed this, would be around 480 kilometers, per week. And that would be quite a lot. Let's say I changed it to the FastFitnessTips beginner plan. I said I've only got 1.5 hours per week. Then it will tell me my TSS is going to come down to 245. That's fairly easy on intensity. It's a reasonably efficient model, and that my kilometers a week are going to be around 250, okay? It'll also tell me time in zone. It'll work out for me. My time in zone 1 should be then in this model 4 hours, time in zone 2, 2 hours 15, 3, 1 hour, zone 4, 40 minutes, zone 5, 18, zone 6, 8, and there's the TSS load for each of those. Let's say I was improving and I increase that to 2 hours, how would that change? Let's say I change the plan to like the super polarized 80-20, how would that look? Or to the Stogel and Sperlich model, how would that look? You know, this calculator will basically work out any training model for any athlete based on any input, whether that is cycling threshold, lactate threshold based heart rate, whether it's maximum heart rate, or whether it's your typical power, you know, a watts based system. That is the beauty of this training calculator. Okay, boom guys, that is the way to do it. But I think it's time to take stock, because I've been giving you a lot of information in this video, and I can see some of you, your attention is waning, let's say. So let's do a quick wrap up here. So my take home message is basically this. If you're doing purely low intensity, high volume and nothing else, that's going to be a recipe for gradual deterioration. Unless it was compared to nothing at all, always something is better than nothing. Volume is definitely better than nothing, but you can improve upon it. Just doing low intensity and threshold is also not much better. And actually the evidence shows in those studies, it can actually be worse than almost base training on its own. So we don't recommend high volume, low intensity and threshold, except in a few special circumstances. Obviously, these plans are matched with athlete requirements. However, low intensity and high intensity, like in cycling, we would call that base plus VO2 max training, is a good combination. And generally, that has the strongest evidence based, and we would call that polarized training model. But I would also say a 3-area sophisticated pyramidal plan with base, threshold, and high intensity VO2 max is also good. If you're time crunched, one of the questions is, what should you take out? Well, that's pretty obvious. You take out the things in the middle. You prioritize the high end, zone 5 and 6, and you basically take out zone 3 and zone 4, and then try and keep going zone 1 and 2 to some extent if you can. Now, I'm going to end this video with some training secrets that you may not know, but they're going to be fuel for thought for further work. So the first thing to say is training is never constant. You don't just prescribe polarized training and the athlete continues forever. In fact, it cycles through a structured plan, and that's called periodized. So training is basically polarized and periodized in a very strong model. It might begin with mostly high volume base in the winter with some threshold and some high intensity, but as competition draws closer, the low volume starts to decrease a little bit, The middle zone, zone 2, or in the 5 zone model, zone 3, decreases quite a lot. And then you peak the high intensity pre-competition. For sure, that's a nice way to do it. Another little secret is how much high intensity to do. And essentially, you do need quite a bit of high intensity to boost the low intensity. That's what the latest studies show. And I refer you to this 2017 very new study from Stogel and Björklund, who was published in 2017 in Frontiers, that looked at exactly that question. Okay, to be fair, you guys have made it this far. You've done well. This is a really long video, so I'm going to tell you there is a correlation between the volume of high intensity and the degree of improvement that works out around about 12, 13, 14%. Now, it's not precise, and the decline after the peak is subtle, so there's room to do more volume of HIIT, but basically that's kind of the ballpark that we're talking about. And if you mention frequency and improvement in VO2 max, then we're talking about maybe 3-4 sessions a week in general. That's high intensity sessions, right? On the background of your base. So these are not exact figures because it depends on your capability, your background, your training frequency as a whole. And like, if you look back at the golden rules, the number one is increase your volume, act as a stimulus, have a stimulus that improves your ability. If you don't have that additional stimulus, you're not going to improve, are you? And lastly, I would say you don't necessarily need a coach to tell you what to do, but someone who understands these principles is an advantage. And in that regard, I've got a pre-announcement to make, which is next week. In association with Beretta, we're launching a new online coaching platform that FastFitnessTips and others are part of. Basically, it's super value, low cost coaching, which brings all the principles of good coaching to the table, but at a low price point. And we do that by using the functions that are built into Beretta, i.e. peer-to-peer coaching, online communication, sophisticated analysis tools. More on that next week, guys. All right, guys, I hope I haven't exhausted you too much, but if I have, then take a break, take a rest, and then reboost yourself with the polarized training model, and you'll find that you probably maximize your gains. This is Coach Alex from FastFitnessTips signing off. Don't hesitate to put me any coaching-based questions below this video. And until next time, guys, happy training, happy riding. See you around. Oh, guys, while the titles are running, I just want to remind you that we're just launching this week our new team on Zwift and Zwift Power. Basically, it's part of like the racing league, but all abilities are welcome. You don't have to be super competitive. It's just a way of keeping up your training stimulus over the winter and seeing if these training principles apply. So sign up on fft.tips/team. Come on, guys, you know you want to.